The Halland-class was the most advanced destroyer class ever produced by the Swedish Navy. These destroyers were designed and built with the threat of nuclear warfare in mind and used advanced post-war weaponry. However, due to Sweden's long history of neutrality, their service lives were rather uneventful. The designs, however, had some characteristics that are still worth discussing, as some parts of them are still used by ships in today's navies. Two members of the Halland-class were authorized in November 1948 and were laid down in 1951, and these were Holland and Småland. Both were launched in 1952, with Holland being completed in June 1955 and Småland being completed in January 1956. Standard displacement was 2,630 tons, and the sisters displaced 3,400 tons at full load. They had two sets of de Laval geared steam turbines and two Penway boilers, which powered two shafts, giving 58,000 ship horsepower for a maximum speed of 35 knots. They carried 524 tons of oil and had an endurance of 3,000 nautical miles at 20 knots. Armament consisted of two twin Bofors 120mm 50 caliber Model 1950 guns in an AX layout. These guns were capable of 42 rounds per minute, and they fired a 23.5 kilogram shell at a muzzle velocity of 825 meters per second. The guns also elevated to 80 degrees, meaning they were capable of anti-aircraft fire. Each 120mm gun also carried six 103mm rails for rocket flares, with three being on each side of each turret. Dedicated anti-aircraft weapons included six single Bofors 40mm 70 caliber Model 1948 guns. These were not to be confused with the 40mm 56 caliber Bofors guns found on pretty much every ship in World War II. The 70 caliber guns were intended to replace the older model on a 1-to-2 basis while keeping the same volume of fire. This was achieved by doubling the rate of fire to 240 rounds per minute. The guns were air-cooled but became obsolete once missiles became more prominent, but they are still quite effective against small surface craft, and faster firing variants of this gun are still being used today. They also carried the fully automatic, water-cooled 57mm 60 caliber Bofors Model 1950 gun. Two guns were mounted in a twin turret, which was then mounted in the B position. These were scaled-up versions of the aforementioned 40mm 70 caliber guns, but these guns abandoned the 4-round clip entirely due to their larger size and fed rounds into hoppers instead. These guns were capable of firing at 120 rounds per minute, and the same gun in a lighter mount was also mounted on many post-war French ships, including the cruisers de Grasse and Colbert and the battleship Jean Bart. The ships also carried 8 torpedo tubes, originally 2 quadruple launchers, but in order to solve its surface-to-surface missile launcher on the rear tube, the layout changed to a quintuple launcher forward with a triple tube and SSM combo to the rear. These were the first destroyers outside of the Soviet bloc to have surface-to-surface missiles. Two quadruple 375mm anti-submarine mortars were mounted on the bow, and these were to work in conjunction with a retractable hydrophone under the ship to ward off any submarine attacks. The ships were comparable in size to the American Gearing class, being slightly longer and slightly thinner. The ships were also designed with nuclear warfare in mind, and so members of the class had a massive steel superstructure, meaning that the crew could theoretically traverse the entire ship without going outside and risking radioactive contamination. But if the nuclear option was used, this would probably be a moot point. The two ships served together in a destroyer division, and after the decommissioning of the cruisers Tre Canonniere and Gotha Leon, they were the most powerful ships in the Swedish Navy. Holland was eventually struck in 1987 and scrapped, but Småland was handed over to the Maritime Naval Museum in Gothenburg, where she remains today as the largest ship in the 19-ship-strong museum fleet. In 1955, another pair of the class was authorized, and these ships were to be named Lapland and Varmland. However, Swedish doctrine was in the midst of adapting to the realities of a nuclear world, and with the fairly reasonable note that large warships were unlikely to survive nuclear Armageddon, particularly in the cramped Baltic Sea, the two ships were cancelled in 1958 without having been laid down. Two half-sisters were built for export to Colombia with a focus on gun warfare, these two ships being called Viente de Julio and Siete de Agosto, and they mounted a third 120mm turret in lieu of the 57mm gun, carried 4 torpedoes instead of 8, mounted a single anti-sub mortar, and had different interior arrangements and electronics due to the different need of a South American Navy.